So we're continuing our series on the Acts of the Apostles and exploring the very early church in that first century and reminding ourselves that many people say that as the church is living now, we are actually more like the church in the first century than like any other time. We are no longer the establishment church. It's no longer the thing to do to come to church. And that's why every week we often thank people who come to church, because it's so countercultural. And, when did that happen? But here in Victoria, the most secular city in Canada, there's 50% of the people in a 2013 survey that are nuns or duns. Nuns, they've never heard the stories. Duns, they've been to church and they're so done with that. They've just drifted away. So into that climate, we find that people are a bit more chippy with the church. Last week we sent the card that we had been signing to Oak Bay United Church, because as they're trying to do a redevelopment that is in line with what the Oak Bay Council wants, more rental accommodation, there's a huge protest in their neighborhood. And it's not just that there's a disagreement, but people are kind of this has become a reason to say several mean things to the church. And you see, we thought, and it's not that many years ago, that we enjoyed the goodwill of the community. It was one of the things that we could count on. People would say, well, the church does good stuff in the community, so let's be tolerant. Now that the nuns and duns are at the 50% point, now that the philosophy of secularism has almost silenced the churches and religions, well, it's a different climate. And so we sent a card last week to Oak Bay United Church, telling them that we're thinking about and reading Acts of the Apostles and thinking about the first generation of Christians and how they worked to encourage each other. And so we said we were just sending them a card to encourage them and to say that we see what's happening for them, and to take heart. We were sending our love and our support to them. In this climate, one of the things that has become very clear is that we have to become as clear as Peter and John were in our story today about what is our reason for being. If we do not have a reason for being that is different than the community center, people will say, well, you can just close and we'll have the community center. It's paid for by our tax money. If we do not have a purpose that we can articulate that is different than any one of the excellent helping organizations that are in Victoria, people will say, well, we pay for those with our tax money. We'll just start to tax you because really you're not doing anything special. That early church and those disciples they had to learn how to articulate that which was unique about the Spirit of Jesus, about the stories of Jesus. Somebody was telling me that back in the 1980s, when many churches who had church-run Sunday school or church-run preschools, they were letting those become parent participation or just secular preschools, because that was a radical thing to do in that day, for the church not to have such control. But now, churches that are beginning preschool programs and daycare programs, the radical churches are actually adding a spiritual component to it. They're fighting back against the being silent and about being silenced. So they are like Peter and John say in The Thing, whether it is right in God's sight to listen to you, that is, to be quiet, rather than to God, who has put a story in their hearts, you must judge. For we cannot keep from speaking about what we have seen and heard. In this day and age, when the church is so easily overlooked, we, like that first century church, have to learn how to speak about what we have seen and heard. Chris Corrigan, he's a fellow who came here, I think, and worked as a church consultant with this congregation when you were exploring kind of what kind of options you wanted for ministry. And he's traveled around a lot in BC and in Alberta as a consultant to churches that are trying to find their way. He said, he was telling me, because he lives on Bowen Island, so sometimes I had coffee with him. He said, he went to his mother's church, and she said, my son will come and help you. So he did. And so he said to them, what do you do? And they told him all these great things that they do in the community. And he said, so who else is doing those? They said, well, that's the trouble. The community center now is running the same program. He said, so if you didn't have that program, who are you? And he just kept asking that question. And he said he was like totally saddened because there was not one person who said, we keep alive the stories of Jesus. Jesus' name was not even mentioned, and he couldn't get them to mention it because they had lost their story. They had lost their reason to be. They didn't know whose spirit they were attempting to keep alive. I talked to somebody this week who's the minister of a little church that is at this point largely overlooked in their community. nobody pays any attention to the little church. And the person said, but everybody is at the seniors club. But it was our members who started it because they thought that's what Jesus would have done. And everybody loves the seniors club. They didn't know to whom they were indebted. And the little church hadn't found a way to have the two people who started that wonderful program, hadn't helped them to say, because I think this is what Jesus would have done, I'm doing this. Right? Our reason for being, if there is one thing that is unique about churches, is that we are the ones who hold these early stories of a guy who was a radical in his day, who went around walking with people and talking with people and helping them to have hope. He believed that in the ancient stories there was wisdom if people would just play with them. There's a lot of barriers to the Christian community existing today. I get it. Sometimes our worship is boring. Sometimes people don't want to sit and listen to somebody talk for all this length of time. Some days I don't blame them. But that our form, this form, is not our story. This form could pass away, and we would find, if we were a thriving Christian community, we'd find another way to slip in the stories of the one who is our inspiration, the one after whom we are proud to be named. Well, thank you for listening.